2019 Gross Domestic Product Report, as released by the National Bureau of Statistics, shows that the country's economy grew by 2.27% in the last quarter of 2019. This defies all conventional indicators, rules and protocols, especially as the International Monetary Fund had projected that the nation's economy would grow by 2.1% in 2019. What makes this unprecedented growth spectacular is that this is the first time Nigeria's economy will record highest quarterly GDP growth since 2016. What are the factors responsible for this growth? How can the trend be sustained, and is it an indication that the good times are here for the country's economy? These are the questions we will be giving answers on today's edition of Panorama from the Lagos Network Center. I am Hingino John Adams. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for staying with us. Report just reaching us says the Federal High Court sitting in Abuja has found former People's Democratic Party spokesman Alisa Metu guilty of unlawfully collecting 400 million naira from the office of the National Security Advisor without executing any contract for government. The court, presided over by Justice Okonabang, proceeded that to assume jurisdiction over the matter, taking cognizance of a Supreme Court judgment affirming same. On the 7-count amended charge against Alisa Metu and his company Destra Investments, the court held that there was no documentary evidence that former President Goodluck Jonathan authorized the former National Security Advisor, Colonel Sambo Dasuki, to transfer the money to Metu. The court held that Metu ought to have known the source was illicit, and the first defendant's argument that it was for security purpose was not supported by facts. The court observed that transfer from the 400 million in Metu's bank account to various political functionaries was also proof that the money was used for the People's Democratic Party's political activities in 2015 and Metu's personal use. The court also found him guilty of destroying his written statement before the EFCC. Deteriorating security situation in parts of the country, President Muhammadu Buhari has summoned the nation's security chiefs aimed at finding facts and charting the best way forward. The strategic meeting held behind closed doors had in attendance the Chief of Defense Staff, all the service chiefs, and the Inspector General of Police. State House correspondent Adamu Sambo reports that the critical engagement is coming days after the renewed Boko Haram attacks in parts of the northeast, where valuable property was destroyed. At the meeting, which lasted about an hour, an appraisal of the security situation was made and far-reaching measures taken towards addressing the situation. The security chiefs maintained sealed lips after the engagement with the president. NTA News, however, learned that President Buhari insists on more proactive, aggressive, and decisive actions against the terrorists and other criminal activities across Nigeria. The president described the prevailing security situation in the country after a long period of respite as unacceptable. Now, away from security, the federal government is tightening loose knots around the ease of doing business in the country, as erring public officials are now to face administrative discipline as well as prosecution. This is coming as the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, PEBEC, and the Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission, ICPC, are partnering to cleanse the Nigerian business environment of every impediment. State House correspondent Gideon Ifade reports.
This meeting are heads of ministries, departments and agencies and senior officials of private organizations who are members of the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council. It is the council's first meeting in 2020 and two critical issues are on the table. One is the presentation of the second annual report of PEBEC, which chronicles the activities of the council in the last 1.5 years.
can really do a lot in terms of improving the image of the country.
Second is how to sustain and further improve on Nigeria's ranking.
And some of the feedback and complaints border on corruption of public and civil service officials. So we have a partnership with ICPC for the complaints that come out of the portal to be handed over to ICPC through the departments, ministries, and agencies.
We're escalating the use of administrative sanctions. So, for example, two ways. First, to deal with it administratively when there's a complaint. Secondly, when we investigate and any public officer is found wanting, even before we finish the court processes, the public service rules has provisions to deal with those issues. And we're now collaborating very well with head of service to make sure that those provisions are used immediately.
Perception is very important. The public must know what efforts government is making to ensure that we get these reforms. Because when the international bodies, when they are making their reports or they're conducting their sample opinions, they pick on anybody. So it's important for us also to go out there and let them know what efforts government is making to improve the business and the business environment.
The country is still in the middle of the Action Plan 5.0, and it is hoped there would be more upward movement in the ranking before the end of the action plan. In the State House, Jide Onifade, NT News.
Still talking economy, the growth rate in Nigeria's economy has maintained a trajectory as the nation's gross domestic product grew by 2.55% year-on-year in real terms in the fourth quarter of 2019. Abolade Salami in this report examines the growth performance in the economy.
Africa's largest economy, Nigeria, exceeded its gross domestic product projection for the 2019 fiscal year, thereby surpassing IMF's projection of 2.1%. The country, in a data released by the National Bureau of Statistics, indicates that our annual 2019 real GDP growth rate increased to 2.27% at the end of fourth quarter of the year under review, as against the 2.3% estimated for the year. The highest quarterly growth recorded since 2016 shows that the nation's economy increased by 0.17% compared to the fourth quarter of 2018 that closed the fiscal year in 2.38%, with the non-oil sector contributing over 93% to the GDP growth, as against the 7.27% from the oil sector. This confirms the federal government's determination to develop other key sectors for economic gains.
Our commitment as a government to achieve economic diversification has been at the heart of this administration's economic strategies. Growth in real GDP has been sustained now for 11 consecutive quarters, with a growth of 2.55% recorded in the fourth quarter of 2019. This is up from 2.28% in the third quarter of 2019, and the overall growth full year 2019 is 2.27%. When you compare this growth to 1.91% recorded in 2018, this reflects a good performance.
As the saying goes, that action speaks louder than voice. The consistent increase in economic performance is a clear indication for all doubting Thomas to believe in the economic agenda of the present administration. In Lagos, Abolade Salami, NTA News.
Now, joining me live in the studio to talk more on this is an economic analyst, Johnson Chukwu. You're welcome to our studio.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what's responsible for this growth?
You mean the second quarter GDP performance?
Yes.
I mean the fourth quarter GDP performance.
Fourth quarter.
If you disaggregate the figures for the fourth quarter, you actually observe that the growth was largely driven by the oil and gas sector. The oil and gas sector grew by 6.36%, while the non-oil sector grew by only 2.26%. Remember that overall the quarter four GDP was 2.55%. So, considering the fact that oil and gas sector grew by 6.36%, while the non-oil sector, which account for more than about 93% of the GDP, grew by 2.26%. So you can actually see that, you can safely say that the growth we saw in 2018 2019 fourth quarter was largely attributed to the performance of the oil and gas sector. Of course, we saw crude production about 2 million barrels during the quarter. And it was also reported by the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics that the crude production remained above 2 million barrels throughout the year. So we've seen an improvement, obviously improvement in security situation in the Niger Delta area, which is manifesting in the performance of the oil sector. And we also know that the oil sector lubricates the entire economy. So with a strong performance in the oil sector, we saw a reasonably good performance in the non-oil sector. Though, if you consider the fact that the non-oil sector accounts for the largest share of the GDP. Oil sector only accounted in the fourth quarter for 7.32% of the GDP. Non-oil sector accounted for about 93% of the GDP. So the non-oil sector, in effect, actually depressed the performance of the economy overall. If you consider that a smaller share of the GDP pulled 6.36% growth. And so we must recognize those things. But if you now go further to look at what sectors grew in the non-oil sector, the sector that actually did quite well is the ICT sector. That is information and telecommunication sector, that grew at 8.5% in Q4 2019. And that sector already accounts, in fact, actually the third largest sector of the economy today, behind agriculture, that is about 26% of the GDP, trade that's about 15.99% of the GDP, and then you have the ICT sector coming at about 13% of the GDP. So that that sector pulled a lot of weight. Then when you talk of agriculture sector, that accounts for 26% of the GDP. The growth in that sector was only 2.31% in real terms, but in nominal terms about 13%. Of course, if you talk of nominal terms, you have to look at what we are the price levels in the fourth quarter.
Okay, now from what you just said, what are the prospects for the non-oil sector?
I think we have a long way to go in the non-oil sector. The major heavyweights in the non-oil sector are the agriculture sector. Like I said, it accounts about 26% of the GDP in the Q4 2019, but grew by 2.31%. The ICT sector is actually the big puncher in that non-oil sector that grew by 8.5%. Then if you look at other sectors that are material, the manufacturing sector grew by only 1.2%. And the manufacturing sector accounts for about 8% of the GDP. So if you consider the sector that will be pulling strong weight, you should be talking about how do we stimulate manufacturing sector, how do we stimulate trade. Trade accounts for about 16% of the GDP. Trade actually contracted by 0.58%. So if you can stimulate growth in trade, growth in manufacturing, further growth in agriculture, further growth in ICT, you're going to have a more robust growth in the economy.
So what strategies can we put on ground to stimulate these sectors you just mentioned?
You know, interestingly, for the agriculture sector, the government is already doing a lot. But unfortunately, because of our level of agricultural activity, which is still largely subsistent in nature, we are still significantly dependent on nature. So if you have good rains, then you have good harvest. Then if you have poor rains, you have poor harvest. We need to move to the point of irrigation, which means we need to support agriculture sector with infrastructure. If you have irrigation, for instance, the rice that we have been trumpeting, today we are still doing one season rice farming, but rice has a gestation period of about 4 months. So if you have irrigation along the corridors where we are doing rice farming, you could actually have 2 season rice production, where you have both paddy rice and upland rice. But unfortunately, we are only dealing with, in the southern part of the country, we are dealing with only paddy rice, and in the northern part of the country, we are dealing with only upland rice. So that's one aspect. So with irrigation facilities, we will improve rice yield and rice production. If you go to the manufacturing sector, today they are enjoying some level of lower interest rate, but they are suffering severe infrastructural deficits. Energy supply is very weak, so we need to improve on energy supply. The ICT sector, what we need is more of appropriate regulatory oversight. At some point, some of them will have major issues with regulators. Some of them still are dealing with the issue of right of way, where the state government are imposing double taxation of them. So we need to get the government agencies to recognize that the ICT sector has become the fowl, or whatever you call it, that lays the golden egg. and we must do everything to support that sector. Other sector that we need to support are construction industry. It's also not growing well. And but the basic thing is that all this require appropriate policy environment to stimulate faster economic growth.
Okay, now let's look at the closure of the land borders. Do you think it's part of what affected the growth we witnessed in Q4 2019?
Well, in nominal terms, yes. When I say nominal terms, which I say, look, if you look at the agricultural sector, it grew in real terms at 2.31%, but in nominal terms about 13.08%, which means the nominal term reflects current market values, current prices. And if you observe, we saw a lot of price increases, which is manifested in inflation rate today, during the last quarter of last year. So those price increases led to significant performance in the agricultural sector in nominal terms. But in real terms, you will adjust for price changes, and you found a growth rate of 2.31%. So to some extent, you can say, look, the border closures had some impact on the agricultural sector because it was food crop production that, if you look at the change in market value, you saw a very material increase. But ultimately, the border closures will have enduring impact if we build the supporting factor that will make us to produce at competitive prices. We must produce whatever we have stopped from coming at competitive prices, because ultimately, in the long run, the borders will be opened. Some of those products will come back to the country. Our products we are producing locally must be able to compete with them in terms of costs. If we do not, the industries, the national industries that will have sprung up as a result of the border closure will all collapse.
Okay, now the 2020 GDP projection growth of 2.93%. Looking at the current reality, the global oil market as regards the coronavirus, coupled with the efforts of the federal government at achieving a sustained economic growth, do you think the country can meet its projection?
Well, if you look at the fact that we closed 2019 at 2.27%, the basic things will be dependent on what policies we are able to come up with and how do we drive those policies. You see, economic performance is not a chance event. It's not a matter of luck. It has to be, what are those policies you have, and how does those policies are affecting the different sectors of the economy, and what are you doing to stimulate the sectors where you have competitive advantage? There are a couple of the sectors we have competitive advantage. Take, for instance, the oil and gas sector. The oil and gas sector, interestingly, when you look at crude refining, which is the manufacturing sector, you realize very weak performance. But we produced the crude. We saw a growth in crude production, and we saw a strong oil and gas performance. But in terms of beneficiation, we are quite weak. So the key thing is that we need to come up with policies that will drive sectors of the economy we can have competitive advantage. If we have those appropriate policies, the economy should grow at even above the 2.93% they are projected for this 2020.
So, Mr. Chukwu, before I let you go, how can the country sustain this trajectory growth?
You know, unfortunately, the growth we saw in the last quarter is very, how do I put it? It was based on some factors, exogenous factors that we can't control. If you look at the fact that crude was what drove the growth. So we must pray that crude prices remain strong. Well, as on our own side, we must make sure we maintain the peace, or the relative peace in the Niger Delta. If we maintain relative peace in the Niger Delta, we should be able to sustain crude production even above 2 million barrels. Remember, in the third quarter of last year, the crude production was about 2.04 million barrels. It actually declined marginally in the fourth quarter. So we can actually go back to that level. If we're able to sustain crude production above 2 million barrels, then we should have growth rate in the same range that we have achieved. The key thing, then the other areas are the non-oil sector, which for me should be the primary focus, because that's where the jobs are created. That's where we are going to have a more robust, or what you may call, people say the growth is not pervasive, or the growth should be able to reach everybody. It's when the non-oil sector is growing.
All right, Mr. Chukwu, sorry, I'm going to cut you here. Thanks for coming on the program, we will now join our outside broadcast team at Ore Industrial Layout in Ondo State for the inauguration of the state's industrial hub by President Muhammadu Buhari.
This is the network service of the NTA. We now join our outside broadcast crew for a live telecast